Hey guys, welcome back. This is episode 8 and we're still on that influencer marketing track. Today we're going to be talking about the 1-9-90 model of influence. So before we define the model, we need to establish what a market is. Now there are thousands of markets in our economy, locally, globally, and a market really is a place where people go to buy and sell products and services. There's a balance of supply and demand, and there's no point in supplying products that people aren't interested in or don't want to buy. So let's take fashion as an example. You have handbags and purses, jewelry, designer jeans, sports apparel, sneakers, wedding gowns and dresses. Now, even within each of those markets, there are more markets. If you think about sneakers, you can buy a pair for $100, $200, $300, up to $1,000 on GOAT. Or you can drive down to your local Kohl's and buy a pair of sneakers for $30. And to make it even more complicated for marketers, the way you market and sell products in one part of the country is going to be different than you do in a different part of the country. And it's just as complicated on the enterprise software side. You have data center, cloud, security, infrastructure, voice communications. And within each of those markets, you have different buyers. And to make it more complex for the B2B marketer, all those buyers change depending upon the size of the company. It's really difficult to reach a market. And that's where the 1-9-90 model comes in. So the model isn't something that I came up with. In fact, it's been around for probably about 15 years. And one of the earliest references that I found about the model was in a blog post written by Jakob Nielsen. And Jakob Nielsen is a wicked smart PhD, has several hundred patents, and is still around today. In fact, he's close to my house here in the Bay Area. Now, in his blog post, he doesn't refer to it as the 1-9-90. He calls it the 90-9-1 rule for participation inequality. And his hypothesis, backed by research, was that 90% of internet users at that time, which was 2006, were lurkers. They would read and observe, but they didn't really contribute much to the internet. And it makes sense, right? There wasn't a lot of social media. There wasn't a lot of platforms or blogs even back at that time. 9% of users contribute from time to time, but are involved in other things. 1% of users participate a lot and account for most of contributions on the internet. So part of his analysis came from Technorati, and at that time they reported that there were about 1.1 billion internet users and only 55 million had blogs, and that's about 5%. He also pulled data from Wikipedia at that time where there were about 99% of users who were lurkers. And according to their About page, it had about 68,000 active contributors, which is about 0.2% of the 32 million unique visitors at that time. So now it's time to define the 1-9-90 model. But before we do, I just want to say that everyone is influential. Everyone has influence over someone else. When's the last time you went to a dinner party and recommended a restaurant or a new pair of shoes? And 9 times out of 10, that person's either going to take your advice or they're not going to take your advice. And so everyone is influential in that regard. So the model is not black and white, and I'm going to try to address that as we go here. But again, it goes back to the market. Now, however the market, however large it is, however small it is, however you define it, 1% of that market creates content. They're the influencers. They are driving the conversation through online, through word of mouth. They are blogging. They are on podcasts. They are on webinars. They could be writing articles. Now, back in the day, it was just the media. And that has changed quite a bit over the last 10 years or so, because you don't have to be a journalist or an analyst to be within that 1%. So moving on to the 9%, I call them advocates. Sometimes I refer to them as the audience or sharers. And what they do is they share and repackage content, but they also provide their perspective and they contextualize influencer content and they have their own point of view. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of overlap between the 1% and the 9%. So the 90% is very similar to what Nielsen was talking about. These are the lurkers. I call them enthusiasts. It's the broader market. It's the consumer. They rely on word of mouth, peer recommendations. They Google everything. They read Amazon reviews, Yelp reviews, and they're highly influenced by that 1 and 9%. In fact, a lot of times that 90% will validate how well the 1 and 9% are telling a story about either a topic or your brand. So I have 2 examples of how this plays out, both on the consumer and the business side. Now, Kathy Horn is a fashion journalist. She's written for the New York Times. She's been quoted in several different publications like Women's Wear Daily, Fashionista, Business of Fashion, and Vanity Fair. And one thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about the model was that influencer content dominates Google. When I Googled fashion journalist, one of her articles came up. And I also did a little bit of research and found that 96% of her audience is interested in fashion. So in the market of fashion, she is the 1%. So within that same context and within that fashion market, we have Jacqueline Grieve, and she's a great blogger. She writes for Style Hawking fashion blog. Now, she's also very influential. She curates a lot of beautiful imagery around fashion on Instagram and other platforms. Now, the 90% is kind of everybody else, right? It's those people who are Googling, asking their friends for recommendations. On the business side, we have Amanda Russo, and she is not a journalist. She's actually a security researcher at Facebook, and she's Malware Unicorn on Twitter, in case you're interested. Now, she's been featured in the LA Times, and she's also hosted several videos on the Wired YouTube page. So again, as I said earlier, you don't have to be a journalist or an analyst to be influential. In fact, the majority of the influencers that I find are not in the media. So moving on to the 9%, we have Rodrigo Branco. Now, not to be confused with the Brazilian soccer player, he is a principal engineer at Amazon. Okay, so again, he is highly influential. He speaks at several events. He's very active on social media. So just to recap, the 1990 model of influence, it's a way to segment influence across different topics, different categories, and more importantly, different markets. Now, the 1%, they are driving the conversation. When they speak, people listen. When they write, people read. When they record, people share. The 9% repackages that content, provides their own context, their own point of view, and then shares it. The 90%, they consume everything. They Google, they follow, they read, they ask, and they are essentially the ones that are validating your brand story through the 1 and 9%. So that concludes the video for this week. Really do appreciate your time. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, if you have any feedback, please let me know. If you have any ideas for content you want to see in the future, I'd be happy to do that. And until next time, have a great week.